families and our lives. On the other hand, hosting almost 300 participants would have not been possible, at least in this audience, nor it would be possible to fly over today's speakers from New York and London just to participate in this event. So there is definitely an upside to this new normal, and our societies are taking first steps in coping with it. And this reality is no different for the private equity industry we're going to discuss today. This pandemic has had a tremendous impact on private equity firms, their portfolios, and their investors. Today, we invited executives from Neuberger Berman, APG, and Blue Sky Group to share with us their experience and also their ideas for the future of the industry. Please feel free to post all your questions in the chat box during the event, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible. But we start today with our keynote speaker, who does not need any introduction, at least not for the members of the Oxford Business Alumni Association on this call, Ludovic Phalippou, Professor of Financial Economics at Saïd Business School. Ludo, please feel free to turn on your camera and your audio so we can see you and we can hear you. There you are.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you dedicated over 20 years of your life to research in private equity. You published many articles, books, and blogs, and it's a real honor to have you with us today. Thanks a lot for joining. Let me start with this. January last year, the first information about viral pneumonia was picked up by the authorities and the media. Things moved rapidly throughout February until COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11, which is exactly 1 year ago. And many of us will remember March as the month where life changed in Europe, as many countries issued lockdowns amid rising hospitalizations and deaths due to the virus. So let's just start by going 1 year back. How did this pandemic affect you personally, your activities at Saïd Business School, your academic research? What has changed for you?
That would take an entire hour, but it's a very interesting question. I think it's we should communicate more about it as a school, because what we have done at Saïd is dramatic, and I think very good example for many schools. So a lot of schools simply switched to Zoom, and then that was it. At Saïd, we decided to completely rethink, at the same time as we were switching on Zoom, the delivery of our courses. In fact, I had been pushing conversations for a long time. In fact, as soon as I joined Saïd, I wanted to have a partnership with Coursera to develop online courses and things like that. And the discussions had been a bit slow, but they were starting to pick up. So 1-2 years before the pandemic, we started an online executive education program. I put together a private equity course online a year before the pandemic hit, and it was released 6 months before the start of the pandemic. So we had started to digitalize some things. And the view we had was like we wanted to give more digital material to students. And in particular, the view I was pushing for was that we should stop having lectures where we provide information. I should stop having a lecture where I explain how capital structure works. This needs to be taped with video, and this is done once for all. And just like you would read a book, you can watch this video whenever you want, but the sessions with the students need to be Q&A. So students need to watch the information part, and then we have a Q&A, and same for the guest speakers. What I hadn't completely seen, though, is that there would be this Zoom fatigue or this video fatigue of people. And so what I've learned during the pandemic was that actually the winning ticket is not so much the videos, but it's the podcast. because the podcast is something that you can listen on the go. So you can listen to something. If you don't need to like make people see something, a concept you're explaining, and you can just describe it in words, then the podcast is the best because people can run, take transport, like be on the move, cook, do anything while listening to the podcast, and they can really do these two things at the same time. So I think the winning ticket is that we transform all the information part of the lecture, the one-way delivery, into things like podcasts. And in fact, this podcast series I started is basically per item in class, and it is built as if I was writing a textbook for private equity or as if I was teaching my private equity course, and including, well, I'm inviting all my guest speakers basically. And so the idea is that the students can listen to a podcast, and then I invite this guest speaker, but then we start more or less right away with the Q&A. It's like you've listened to the guest speakers telling you what they do in life and so on. So let's start with the questions instead of a guest speaker every time explaining what it is they do. And so Saeed has done like, yeah, a huge amount of things. We had empty buildings. We have a lot of hotel rooms effectively because we have all these executive education programs in residence. We converted that, and then we used it as shelters for homeless and for women who were victim of domestic abuse and so on and so forth. So the number of things we did in that period is absolutely shocking. So while a number of schools simply switched to Zoom and said, like, that's it.
Well, it sounds like it's been a very busy year for you. And actually, I just wanted to also to mention your podcast series. I'm finding to be very interested. For everyone who is not familiar with it, please go to pelaidbear.com/podcast, and I highly recommend it. To start with some very general questions. As COVID-19 pandemic brought the markets in the first quarter of the last year to almost a standstill, did private equity demonstrate their ability to adapt? What is your take on what private equity was going through in 2020 and how they were coping with it?
Yeah, so these are very interesting questions. That's not my forte. I usually analyze the past with extensive data and enough distance. So the short answer is that I don't know. What I can say from a broad picture point of view is that of all the forms of corporate ownership, private equity tends to be more responsive to things. And the reason for that is that people are so highly incentivized on making money that if there is any problem, they are usually the first to intervene and react. So that we had some evidence of that in the 2008 crisis, where the private equity owned companies were the first to renegotiate their debt packages before corporates with similar amount of leverage did. And we think that it is due to the incentives that the private equity industry works under that people have been very reactive.
Okay, well, that's on the positive side, but let me also now ask a critical question, because traditionally private equity firms were frequently accused of asset stripping, cost cutting, loading balance sheets of companies with debt. Do you think that this pandemic is going to reinforce this image, or are you observing any structural changes into a different direction?
One thing that is quite funny with researching private equity is that 90% of what people believe is true about it is the exact opposite. So it's quite fascinating. I don't know that many industries where it is that everything is like kind of upside down. Maybe that's why I use Alice in Wonderland as a theme in my book. Stripping assets, first of all, what it refers to is technically selling a division of a company, right? There is nothing wrong with selling a division of a company. And in fact, in most cases, everybody, including the employees, are very happy with their division, being free or being sold on or something like that. So even if we took asset stripping, which is a bad name, but literally, we don't really see what would be the issue for society about asset stripping. Of course, if you say it this way, it feels bad, but if it's selling divisions,
it has a negative connotation to it.
Yeah, you're selling a division. Okay, so what? And often you do want that to happen for everyone involved. So it's not really clear it would be bad. And the other thing that is weird is that it's the opposite of what private equity does, because the last 10, 15 years, so not in the 80s. In the 80s in the US, there was a lot of divisions being sold out of conglomerates, but it was not even the case in Europe. It was mainly US private equity industry. And in Europe, was not really there. And the last 15 years everywhere in the world, what private equity has been doing is what's called buy and build. So if anything, they have added a lot of companies to existing companies. So then, but even that, then lots of people said, oh, then that's good. It's the opposite of asset stripping. Well, hold on to it, because we actually need to think a lot harder about what that means, because this consolidation, which is the nice word to use for it, has consequences for people. We see now, dentists, fitness centers, etc., getting, you have free brands in an entire country. What does that mean for the consumer, for the prices they pay, for competition, etc.? There are some positive aspects, but we need to not be too naive about it and think also about the negative possible consequences of consolidation. So it's quite weird, this thing of like, asset stripping. So the opposite is happening, but actually the opposite is not necessarily that good. And we need to think a lot more rationally about these things. Cost cutting, yeah, it has always existed. Again, sometimes it's good. Usually it does hurt some people. Yeah, so I don't think in this crisis they have cut costs more dramatically than anyone else. I don't think that will be something that will come out. What will come out, however, is the use of leverage. Now, they're not the only one to use leverage, but they're using leverage quite in a rather punchy way. And so now that I think could create an issue, because what happened effectively is that when it is a bit weird that all the countries have this rule whereby leverage is effectively tax subsidized by the government, right? You get a subsidy for using leverage because the interest payment on a capital claim that is deemed leverage is tax deductible, and the distribution on a capital claim that is deemed equity is non-tax deductible. So that is subsidized, and the deal usually is like, well, okay, so, and the leverage effect is that if things go well, then you will make a lot more money than, if you hadn't levered up. But if things don't go well, you're going to be killed much more quickly, right? So a slight downturn can be enough to kill you if you have tons of leverage. So that's usually the deal. Okay. So now what happened in this crisis is that, well, right before the crisis, the guys who were levered and things were going well, there were, it was happy times, or very happy times, thanks to the leverage. And then you have a crisis that, again, just even an epsilon of that should have been enough to kill people that are 90%, 80% levered. And what happened then is that for a while, the first set of rules, the government said, well, we're going to help companies, but only the ones that are not too levered before entering the crisis. And so effectively saying, we're going to help everyone except private equity held companies. Lobbying was successful. It was decided that any company would be rescued. So what we ended up having is that then you have people having maximum leverage. Then if things go well, they are very rich. And if things go bad, the taxpayer is picking it up. And that I think that, when we will be counting sheep after the crisis, this is going to be part of tensions that will be out there, alongside massive inequalities. Because what has happened is quantitative easing has not only favored the private equity industry, but most generally has favored tremendously asset owners, the wealthier asset owners, and the other people, like people working as nurses and school teachers, etc. Their pay has remained constant throughout, and if anything, they have suffered a bit. And so that I think is going to be then a very big issue. And the fact that private equity was these highly levered people that then make tons of money, things go well, and then were rescued, is probably going to be a source of tension. And what makes it even like more dramatic here is that private equity is, roughly speaking, investing in 3 types of industries. And that's also a new phenomenon. So in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, there was no tech in private equity. There was a bit in venture capital, but it was less than in buyouts. So tech was a relatively small fraction. Nowadays, there are tons of 1/3 of buyouts are in the tech space. So a lot of private equity in dollar amounts is in the tech space. And all these investments have done amazingly well during the crisis, just like any other tech companies. So these guys were highly levered with tech in it, just go through the roof, make tons of money. And the guys, and 1/3 of industries in things like retail, leisure, like, these sorts of space. And these people should have been wiped out in one sec, with just even like a crisis would have been 1/10 of that magnitude. In the UK, almost every restaurant chain is held by private equity. So you shut down restaurants, like these guys should die in a week. and then they get rescued, so they're fine. And maybe they will be hurt when it reopens, and they will not quite recover. But so far they're fine-ish. And then the other third is like healthcare, and then in healthcare you have some who benefited and some who were hurt, right? So because you have a number of healthcare things like, I don't know, cosmetic surgery or things that people didn't quite spend money on during the pandemic, and so but some other healthcare things did well. So that I think will come up as a question. The question of taxation inequalities have been magnified in this crisis. It was already big walking in, partly because of the quantitative easing effect. Now this crisis just multiplied it by 10. And it's amazing. Like people who are working in practical industry, the funds that are more into retail leisure are just okay, but all right overall. And the ones in the other sectors is just huge paydays, etc. And people are going to be very upset. So they don't see too much. Most of it is kind of hidden. But I don't see how this is going to be sustainable. And I'm extremely concerned about stability in general. So far, I guess people have over worries. And maybe once we open up, people will be so exuberant and party, and they will not even question anything. But sooner or later, people are going to ask about these massive inequalities that have been created.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll see how it play out. But it was a very, very neat summary of what's going on indeed. A different question. As private equity firms are looking to create and preserve value, they might also look at the strategies that work and did not work during this pandemic. As the Warren Buffett famously said, it is only when the tide goes out you discover who has been swimming naked. In other words, this crisis should help private equity funds to identify if the management of their portfolio companies was fighting for survival, or if they were really trying to capitalize on changing market conditions and were successful in it. So are these winners and losers already emerging? Do we already know what type of behavior generated high performance, or is it still too early to say?
No, I think that by and large, it's an industry effect. The winners are people who are in tech. The losers were people who are in retail and the like. And I want to take the opportunity of this question to highlight something that has been said during the crisis. That was that if you behave well, if you like ESG friendly and so on and so forth, you did better during the crisis. I think this type of reasoning, and I have a video on YouTube where I give my views on ESG impact space, it's extremely counterproductive and dangerous. The reason companies that have high ESG scores did well during the crisis is because somehow people rated companies that were in tech as ESG friendly and rated companies that were in oil and the like as ESG unfriendly. And during this crisis, anybody in oil has been hurt because planes stopped flying and so on and so forth. So that's it. So it's an industry effect. So same thing here. You could say, oh, there are some funds that did better during this crisis. These are funds that were nicer to employees and so on and so forth. This will be epsilon compared to the industry effect. It's which industry you were in that dictates how well you did during the crisis. Maybe we will manage to tease out in the data how at the margin you treated employees or things like that helped in that space. I do have an exciting paper on that coming up. I don't have enough data yet on during the pandemic, but we are doing a study where we have like 4 million reviews of people of employees of their employer, and we look at how it differs for practically health companies versus not. And so as we will update the data, we'll be able to see as well what people said during the crisis if their employer was a practically versus someone else. But something else that my research experience has shown and comes out in this paper very clearly is that the private equity industry is often portrayed as something homogeneous, and it's really a tale of two industries, like for what I saw in many papers. It's that on the one hand you have the people that I would call cowboys, it's a world where there is no regulation. You can get away with tons of stuff, and yet some people just behave very, very, very widely, and they are there to make as much money as possible, and they would do whatever it takes, and don't care about anything else whatsoever. And then you have another set of private equity firms who are very serious people, who know how to run companies better, help, are kind to employees, and so on and so forth. And so we need to be careful about talking about private equity as a one entity. There is massive dispersion in habits, and people moving from one to the other. Some people who maybe started as nice when they were small, as they become bigger, becomes more and more cowboy-like. So that's important to bear in mind. But for the winners and losers, the industry is going to drive all the effect. Like 90% of the effect will be an industry one.
Interesting. And something else here, because we all know that this pandemic redefined the way we do business and the way we live. We've seen basically this whole world moving to the digital environment with remote working, online shopping, etc., becoming our new normal. And most likely we're not going back to the pre-pandemic situation. What does this mean for private equity industry? Is the pandemic going to redefine the industry for good, or do you think that we will go back to pre-pandemic business model structures and practices? Is there something that is going to be different?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe people will have less face-to-face meetings and be a bit less obsessed about like traveling around the world for one meeting, which would be a good thing. But overall, I don't think it would change much. It's very different from 2008. In 2008, really, like people were on their knees, and you had the balance of power went from being all into GP hands in 2006, 2007, to being like in LP hands. So the pension funds were in a stronger position. The endowments were in strong positions when talking to fund managers in 2009, 10, and 11. And we saw lots of concessions on fees. We saw contracts that were written a lot more cleanly. We saw people starting to question a lot more hidden fees, all kinds of things. And so we saw ILPA picking up things and really getting some traction where they never had any traction until 2009, 2010. So we saw some real changes after 2008 because the fund managers were on their knees, basically. On this crisis, it's party time. Like these guys are doing extremely well. Money is flowing all over the private equity industry. So there is absolutely no reason to change anything. If anything, it's even more of a party than it was in 2018 and 19. So it just will continue going. There is nothing. It didn't hurt that industry. If anything, it helped it. So you could say, for the hospital industry, they may need to rethink a few things. But here for private equity, it's like, so it's very different from 2008.
Well, I think now is a good moment to bring those industry experts into this conversation and continue with them.